perhaps the most important technical aspect of photography is exposure. Exposure refers to the amount of light that reaches your camera sensor or film when you take a picture. Let's take a look at how the parts of the digital single lens reflex camera, or DSLR, lets photographer control exposure. We can ignore the lens casing for now, and also simplify the lens to show its basic parts. The lenses themselves help focus the light into a size that can be captured by your camera. Also housed in the lens casing is the aperture. The aperture controls a series of leaves that open and close together to create different size openings for light to pass through. Specific opening sizes are called f-stops and can be set automatically by the camera or manually by the photographer. Apertures set to a lower f-stop number reflect a larger opening for light to pass through. Apertures set to a higher number f-stop reflect a smaller opening for light to pass through. The aperture settings are one way that a photographer controls how much light gets through to the sensor. They also control depth of field, which will be talked about in a later lesson. For now, just think of depth of field as how much of an image is blurry versus being in focus. Low f-stop numbers will produce a main subject in focus with the background quickly falling out of focus. This is useful in portraits or when you want to isolate the subject from the background. High f-stop numbers produce pictures where most everything is in focus, which is often what you want in a landscape photo, for example. All that's important for you right now is that you understand that the aperture is one thing that impacts how much light gets through to the sensor, and that different settings affect the final image differently. So that's it for the lens. Now let's take a look at some of the important parts inside the camera body. We have the sensor. In front of that we have the shutter, and in front of that is the mirror. Above them all is the pentaprism, which is what allows you to see through the lens when you look through the eyepiece. Light comes through the lens, it gets refracted or bent through the aperture, and hits the mirror. The light is reflected up into the pentaprism, where it ends up being redirected out the eyepiece that the photographer is looking through. When the photographer takes a picture by pressing the shutter button, the mirror flips up to let the light through to the shutter. How long the shutter stays open and allows light to pass through to the sensor is called the shutter speed. A shutter speed of 1/4 of a second would allow the light that has made it through the aperture to land on the sensor for 1/4 of a second. For now, just understand that fast shutter speeds like 1/2000th of a second are good for freezing action like splashes and sports. Slower shutter speeds like 1/4 of a second to multiple seconds are great for water shots with flowy looking water and for doing light painting. It won't be too long before you know exactly how to create pictures like those I just showed you and be able to do so all on your own. Finally, we need to discuss ISO setting. You can think of the ISO setting as controlling how quickly the sensor is able to collect the light. A low setting like ISO 100 does not collect or record the light very quickly, so it is often used in brightly lit situations. A higher ISO, like ISO 3200, collects light very quickly, so it is often used in low light situations like photographing a live performance or other indoor setting where flash is not permitted. The trade-off between high and low ISO is that as you increase the ISO, more noise becomes visible in the image. So you generally want to use the lowest ISO setting you can for the look you're going for. But we'll talk about that more in detail in the lesson on the exposure triangle. So, those are the basics for how a DSLR camera captures an image. There was a lot of information presented in a very short time. The important takeaways from today are that Exposure means the amount of light that gets to your camera sensor or film. Too much light and your picture will be overexposed or too bright. Too little light and your picture will be underexposed or too dark. What you learned today is that you have 3 ways as a photographer you can control how much light gets to the sensor. The size of the opening in the aperture determines how much light gets through the lens. The duration you leave the shutter open determines how long the camera sensor or film receives the light that has made it through the lens. And the ISO setting controls how quickly your camera captures the light making it to the sensor. Anything else that was presented today is just gravy.